Hello and welcome to the Mobalytics patch 11.7 tier list. I'm Danox Harrison and we have quite a big spread of champion and item changes on the patch, and as per usual our team of experts have reviewed these changes and we'll be going over their initial thoughts and predictions for the patch. Let's get stuck right into it. Starting off with the top lane, in the God tier we have Cho'Gath, Garen and Urgot, and in the S tier we have Wukong, Nasus, Malphite and Darius. So in terms of changes to the top lane, that actually wasn't too much. Mordekaiser got some extra damage on his Q when targets are isolated, which really isn't going to change too much for him and is placed in the current meta. Turbo Chem Tank had its movement speed nerfed, and in return it's been given a slightly stronger slow. Realistically, this is more of a nerf towards junglers who heavily utilize this for gank and skirmish pressure, whereas in the top lane, Stridebreaker tends to be the big craze. One big indirect change that does affect top laners is Lord Dominik's Regards being nerfed. Prior to this patch, this item was so efficient that AD carries were often building its second item. Since it has a ton of armor pen and deals bonus damage to targets with higher health, this was extremely effective at dealing with any bruises or tanks coming out the top lane. With a slight nerf to the gold cost and the AD on the item, it's still going to fulfill its role effectively, but we may see it being built less or at least later, which will mean AD carries don't decimate tanks so quickly into the game. We also saw Triforce with a change where it now grants AD movement speed and ability haste on its mythic passive, and it's had its stats shuffled slightly to be more AD focused. This is going to be solid on Jax, Aurelia and any other champs who utilize it, but ultimately it's hard to scope how this will affect them, and our top lane expert felt that they were unlikely to shift massively as a result of this. Moving on to our highlight champions. Urgot is heavily overperforming in the top lane. He's really effective at dealing with melee matchups due to his shotgun legs, and even into range matchups he's able to farm from a distance more effectively than a melee champion while still offering that kill pressure if he gets in range. Unlike a lot of champions right now, Urgot does not rush his mythic and instead prioritizes Titanic Hydra, as it syncs incredibly well with his W even after the synergy got nerfed slightly. Stridebreaker is typically the go-to mythic as it further increases your ability to get on top of a target and you become incredibly bulky while dishing out huge damage. In teamfights, your best bet is to sit on your carries and provide huge peel for them, decimating any divers, and should you get your ult to connect, then you can go aggressive and land a big fear. Sion is a solid performer right now due to his insane bulkiness. Lord Dominik's is a requirement to even hope to cut through him, but he's still really hard to deal with even with the item. In lane, he actually handles bruises really well as far as tanks go, and he does pretty well in tank vs tank matchups as well. Once it comes to teamfights, the amount of disruption you can lay down is huge, and even building full tank, if you land your ult into a full channel Q, you do huge amounts of damage to squish your targets. Late game, you're going to be taking more damage as AD carries hit their stride, but your infinite HP scaling keeps you relevant as long as the game goes. Similar to Sion in the sense that he's incredibly tanky and has infinite HP scaling, Cho'Gath isn't as good in the early game, but he really hits his stride later on. The definition of a meat shield, you can soak so much damage for your team, and the CC you offer with your Q and W is respectable. We all know the big strength of Cho'Gath though, and that's his ultimate. Being able to secure objectives at a much higher threshold than Smite is a huge asset in the late game, and the fact that you can also chomp opponents for massive true damage makes him almost into an assassin. Cho'Gath does lack mobility, so if you're caught out there's limited ways for you to disengage, but as long as you're grouped and your team are hitting a target, they're likely to die before you are. Moving on to the jungle. In the God tier we have Shaco and Volibear, and in the S tier we have Dr. Mundo, Skarner, Hecarim, Nunu, Rammus, Nocturne, Udyr and Elise. The jungle got a big spread of changes this patch. We saw Udyr's base AD slightly nerfed, which does hurt his clear, although it's not too substantial and his clear was already insanely fast. Hecarim got his E max movement speed reduced, which definitely hurts, especially off the back of his Q nerfs from the previous patch. The big thing that also hits these junglers is a nerf to Turbo Chem Tank. This is less of a factor for Udyr, as although the mobility is great, he's still plenty mobile and won't struggle too much. The big problem is for Hecarim. Now Hecarim needs these nerfs because he was insanely overtuned with the new full tank build people have been going. His passive meant that even when going full tank, he was able to convert his speed into AD, and it allowed him to burst squish your targets while being far too tanky to retaliate onto. Nerfing his E movement speed and chem tank speed will tone down his ability to do this, and his Q nerf last patch also hurt his clear, and although he still looks to be a solid pick with how strong he was already, he definitely will be a sizable amount weaker. We also saw Kindred getting a buff from this patch with the Q bonus AD ratio going up and his E cooldown getting reduced. Definitely nice changes, which has allowed him to sneak onto the list, but he's pretty underwhelming compared to the higher tier picks. We did see the likes of Evelynn and Kha'Zix also get pushed down on the list. They've just been struggling a bit more in recent times, not able to execute as easily, and also being challenged in the early game by a lot of these high tempo, high pressure junglers that are at the top of our list. Amumu had his glory moments earlier in the season, but is looking to make a bit of a resurgence. He got two solid changes on this patch, with his Q mana cost being reduced by a flat 20 and his ECD being knocked down. Considering he already reduces his E cooldown by getting hit, it's a really nice change to help his clear. Amumu also benefits from the fact that we're seeing other junglers get nerfed and the buff to Sunfire we had not too long ago. In terms of gank potential, Amumu is solid, but he really shines with the team fights. Being able to stun an entire team is huge, and he's still able to cause disruption after that with his single target stun and his tankiness. At lower ranks he's always performed solidly, and we're expecting him to be a great pick for 11-7. Nunu is another consistent performer at the lower ranks who's going to benefit from nerfs to his competition. Able to gank effectively with his snowball, he's capable of finding huge early pressure on the enemy team. He's one of the tankier champs even in the early stages of the game, and his sustain while clearing means he's hard to catch out and find on low HP. His consume also allows him to steal camps, secure objectives, and just generally be a menace. When it comes to teamfights, his ult has such a huge amount of zone control it demands respect. The enemy team has to leave as soon as possible or land some CC because even though Nunu builds full tank, it still does massive damage when fully stacked. Xin Zhao got some major changes last patch and we were tentative to shift his placement. Ultimately at higher ranks he still suffers from the same issues where he's outclassed by the current jungle pool and struggles when behind, but at lower ranks his increased engage range and ability to force steady ganks and fights has allowed him to get some solid results. He's definitely a feast or famine champion, but you should be able to feast significantly more often after the changes. Landing your W allows you to E from a huge distance, so it opens up a lot more gank opportunities, particularly against mobile champions who you typically wouldn't have been able to catch. If you like making an impact early in the game, then Xin Zhao is a solid pick for you. Moving on to the mid lane, God tier is actually empty, and in the S tier we have Diana, Nico, Annie, Malzahar, Ahri, Fizz, Anivia, Echo and Katarina. The reason God tier is currently empty is the picks that were there previously didn't feel as relevant, didn't feel as strong, as Ahri was suffering from a nerf to one of her items and Anivia just wasn't performing as well. Nothing really stands out as being worth that God tier at the moment, and we'll see how things develop over the patch. For mid lane in general, we did see a solid nerf to Everfrost on this patch. The active CD got bumped up by 10 seconds and the damage got toned down. It is still strong as it was overperforming heavily on the last patch, but it's much more in line now. Ludens is definitely a competitive option for a lot of champions which have flexibility for the mythics, but for champions like Castet and Ahri who heavily relied on Everfrost, this does make them a bit weaker by a decent amount. We saw minor buffs to Yasuo and Lissandra, but ultimately this doesn't change their placement too much in this list. I did see a lot of people asking about Akali with the changes that came last patch, and they definitely made her better, and after seeing them play out, she has only just managed to make it into the bottom tier, but ultimately Akali always has really bad stats in solo queue, particularly in low elo. If you're really proficient with a champion, or your name's Akali main XD, then she is in a better place than 11-5 and worth giving a go, but she's still not even close to being an optimal low elo pick. Fizz suffered heavily when Verdant Barrier became the MR version of Seekers, but the sizable nerf it took he started to look better and better. Everfrost being toned down also helps out as it limits the tools mages have to deal with him. Fizz excels into mages who rely on skill shots to peel for themselves, with Syndra being a big example. Being able to flip over a stun and land a ton of damage makes him an incredibly effective assassin. Lots of matchups in the mid lane can struggle into Fizz if played incorrectly, and he is very hard to deal with when he starts to snowball. A kill or two can be enough for him to get momentum and becomes extremely problematic when he doesn't even need his ultimate to kill a target 100-0. Zhonya's is a huge pickup for him as it allows him to buy time for his cooldowns and become even harder to pin down. The standard mythic is Night Harvester just to help out with his burst and make that one shot a lot more easier to achieve. In a similar vein to Fizz, Zed benefited when we saw Seekers being nerfed as the item was single-handedly limiting his impact in the mid lane. Zed doesn't rely on mana and has decent wave clear, so you can often just outlast his lane opponents as long as he doesn't take too much harass. Speaking of harass, he can dish it out in force, with his shadow allowing him to land his combo and potentially go for an all-in as well. Zed is another champion who snowballs incredibly effectively, and often your best bet is to go into the fog of war and wait for someone to face check you and look to roam into the side lane. If you arrive to a bot lane fight when they've already committed their mobility, it's a really easy cleanup that can net you 2 kills. Lux is a mage who does pretty well at lower ranks. She's capable of wave clearing effectively while landing harass, she has good defensive tools in the Q and W, and when she hits 6 is capable of bursting targets with huge amounts of damage. The biggest advice I can give to anyone looking to pick up Lux is to be patient with your Q. Missing it does make you potentially vulnerable, and saving it allows you to find windows to shut down your opponent's aggression or make a big play. When Lux hits late game, your ult cooldown gets really short, so you can often just use it for poke as it'll chunk targets and be back in less than 30 seconds. Moving on to AD carries. In the God tier we have Tristana, Seraphine, Sivir, and in the S tier we have Ashe, Jinx, Misfortune, Swain, Jhin and Vayne. We got some huge changes to AD carries on this patch which aren't massively reflected in the tiers simply because it affects so many AD carries. Something that quickly emerged recently was Lord Dominic's Regards being built second item by a huge range of AD carries. Being able to shred any target indiscriminately and being very gold efficient, it was even a solid item against squishier targets. It's now been made 100 gold more expensive and lost 5 AD. The item is still going to deal well with tankier targets, but that efficiency against squishier targets isn't as prevalent, so I like to see more scenarios where it isn't needed. We also saw a nerf to Essence Reaver. It lost 10 AD, but it is now 100 gold cheaper. It's a mixed one because the cheaper cost is of course nice, but it doesn't fully offset the 10 AD lost. A lot of champions were building this item even first just due to the strength of it. Without even factoring in the Sheen passive, this item was 116% gold efficient. Serelda's Grudge is now 200 gold cheaper, which only really affects Ezreal in the bot lane, but he is one of the big Essence Reaver utilizers, so he's unlikely to shift too massively. Now onto the champion changes. Kai'Sa has been hit again, with the nerf to Q damage hurt, but she was hanging on in S tier, but now with her ult CD being 20 seconds longer early, she's been moved down to A tier. She's still good in the right scenarios, but she's not nearly as dominant as she was earlier in this season. Varus got a minor buff to his AD per level, but realistically that's not going to change his place on the list. He has received a range of buffs over the course of patches, but it's never been quite enough to push him up further than A tier. Tristana is really strong. She's actually getting nerfed in this patch and losing 2 base AD, but with how well she's performing, she's still justified to be one of the top tier picks. She has a ton of good matchups as her dueling is really powerful and she can very effectively shove waves in and find priority thanks to her E passive. The burst on her E is insane if you're able to stack it, and if you're paired up with a heavy CC support, there isn't much counterplays to stop you from doing so. Your rocket jump allows you to follow up on your support, and if you get a reset you're able to back out or potentially go deeper. Your mobility and scaling range means in later team fights you're still going to be holding up well. Ashe actually got a really nice buff from this patch which you shouldn't sleep on. It's 10 base damage to a W, but the reason this is so big is the fact that Ashe absolutely spams its ability. She uses it to shove, harass and weave in damage when trading. Ashe was already in a solid spot. She's capable of being built with all 3 of the popular AD carry mythics, and this change is enough to push her into S tier. She's going to be a solid pick to challenge in the laning phase, and she scales well into the later stages. With flexibility in her mythics you can choose which suits the situation best. Dealing with huge tanks, Kraken Slayer. Under threat from assassins, Shield Bow. Need to dodge at Malphite ultimate, Gale Force. With all 3, she'll still output solid damage, and no matter what, her ultimate is always a solid ability. Well, as long as you can hit it. Jinx got some great changes over the past few patches, and she started to rise up more and more in popularity and even started to pop up in pro play. She's now the premier team fighting carry, and if you can get her to the late game and keep her safe, she will decimate the enemy team. She actually does a solid job of keeping herself safe as well, due to the fact that her traps are a great peel tool that can even shut down mobile divers. Her range of her rockets allows her to trade while in lane and keep herself at a safe distance in team fights. A big asset to Jinx that was also changed last year is that her ultimate doesn't have a cap on damage on neutral objectives. To explain that, Jinx's ult deals damage based on the target's missing health. Against low health neutral objectives like Baron, this number becomes massive. Now, you can't hit Baron directly with it as he'll just fly through, but the enemy team is taking Baron and you hit one of them while it's even as high as 3000 HP, you can steal it from them. And yes, I actually saw a Baron executed by this at 3000 HP. There's no way the jungler can ever win a smite battle if your timing is good and you're able to almost endlessly steal objectives from your opponent if they let it connect nearby. It's really obnoxious. Moving on to support, in the God tier we have just Seraphine, and the S tier we have Nami, Morgana, Leona, Blitzcrank, Lulu, Zillion, Bard and Thresh. Now support got some hefty changes this patch. First off, Chemtank being nerfed does affect a range of melee supports who were utilising it as a mythic to gap close easily, Alistar being a big example. Next is the individual nerfs. We saw Thresh have his Lantern Shield now being 40 less at max rank, and this is specifically to target Guardian W max Thresh, who look to combo those together to be able to provide a 500 health shield to allies. Although this does affect Aftershock Q max Thresh slightly, it's not as severe and doesn't really come into play as much until the mid to late game. Alistar had the damage on his Q and his empowered E auto nerfed. He does end up dropping down a tier as a result, although Alistar is still going to be a solid champ who's capable of CCing a bunch of targets. This loss in damage does make his all-ins less threatening, and due to the fact he already had a weak level 1, his laning is going to suffer. Definitely still solid in the right hands, just not going to be as effective. Rel is another one being hit with a nerf bat, and this is coming off some substantial nerfs he got in 11.5. This time the stun on the E is being reduced from 0.75 seconds to 0.5. Initially it doesn't seem too huge, but a big factor is Rel uses her E stun to be able to layer her W afterwards for a C chain. One thing to note is that the change has zero effect if the target has Merc Treads. The reason being is Tenacity cannot reduce the duration below 0.5 seconds, it's the base minimum. So with Merc Treads you are already reducing the 0.75 second stun to around 0.5 seconds, but after the nerf it will simply stay at 0.5 seconds. Unfortunately, if Rel is still problematic for you after the patch, then Merc Treads won't really be a good answer. After a long discussion about all these aggressive supports being nerfed, there's a major one I haven't mentioned, and that's Leona. She's benefiting massively from the fact that a lot of her competition has been toned down, and so as a result is looking to be in a really solid spot for this patch. Aggression is the key. Look to find all in windows and use your short QCD and the huge damage from your passive to pop your opponents. Pairing Leona up, she's best served with an AD carry who can easily follow her in or layer CC. Tristana is a great example of the former, while Jinx does a great job at the latter. When it comes to teamfights, landing on long range ultimate is a great way to set them off, but you can also use your E in tandem with your flash to get that initial CC and then follow up with your full combo. AD carries are really strong right now, with AP items being kinda weak. They're the premier late game carries and they seem to be just hitting that point a lot sooner than historically was the case. Lulu does an amazing job of making your AD carry stronger and keeping them safe against dive threats. I still hold on to the belief that her W is the strongest non-ultimate ability in the game, but you're welcome to head to the comments if you think another is stronger. A point and click ability that renders your targets unable to do anything but slowly move about for over 2 seconds is really hard to play against. Her ult and shield make killing her AD carry twice as hard, and with champions like Jinx looking firmly in the meta, Lulu is a great support to pair them with. Seraphine is still here and still incredibly strong in the bot lane. She has started to fall off in the mid lane, but support and building Moonstone, she's still as overpowered as ever. The sheer healing available is obnoxious, and I know everyone was saying how she's just like a better Sona on release, but right now she's really fulfilling that role. The enemy team will find it extremely difficult to effectively win teamfights against your ult, E and AoE W shield, but even assuming they find a solid engage, if they don't kill you outright, you'll very quickly start to heal up allies. Being able to reset fights, heal up low health targets is just frustrating. We've all experienced that against Soraka, Yuumi and Sona, but this is just on another level. Laning phase is still a bit tentative into more aggressive matchups, but once you get out the laning phase, you're one of the best scaling champions in the game. That wraps things up for 11.7. I hope this has been helpful and you feel a bit more clued up on the coming patch. Be sure to subscribe if you want to keep updated with our tier list, and fly on over to mobalytics.gg to check out the full list in one place. I'll see you next time.